when it comes to sorting through your gear, that can be a little bit of a headache, especially if you're new to these sorts of games or if you're new to Diablo. And to really understand what kind of gear, or rather what lines, when you get a piece of gear and you see the lines that roll, when you want to figure out what's important for you, you want to first understand how the damage buckets work in this game. So they're calling it damage buckets in this game, but actually a lot of games have this sort of mechanic where a game will classify different damage bonuses into different categories, and some of these categories stack additively with one another and some of these categories stack multiplicatively with one another. And in this community they're calling it damage buckets when they're referring to the multiplicative nature of the buckets that stack with one another. So this page, I initially thought a lot of these were multiplicative, but I was wrong. This is a lie actually, because a lot of these actually go into one single additive bucket that then stacks multiplicatively with the other buckets. So there is a community spreadsheet where they tested a lot of things, and I'm going to link it down below, but basically the main damage buckets that stack multiplicatively with one another are going to be the damage bonus from your main stat. So I'm playing a rogue in this case, so my main stat will be dexterity, and you can see that it says that it increases skill damage by X amount depending on how much dexterity you have. So main stat is one bucket. The second bucket is going to be vulnerable damage, and you can see that somewhere over here. Yeah, here you go. The third bucket is going to be crit damage. You can see that here as well. And the fourth bucket is going to be global multipliers, which can be a little bit confusing, but basically every aspect that has, if you look at your aspects or any passives or any glyphs or whatever, if they have a little X next to it, it means that this is all going to the global multiplier bucket. And then that's the fourth bucket, so the last bucket will then be everything else. So everything else that you see here, all damage, damage versus elites, damage versus CC, all of that stuff will go into a main additive bucket, and all of that is summed up and then stacked multiplicatively with all the other buckets that I previously mentioned. So now that you know this, you're going to realize that some stats are just good in general for a lot of different builds, especially when you want to maximize your damage by making use of this multiplicative kind of nature of these different damage buckets. So some of these stats include, for offensive stats, right? You want critical strike damage, you want critical strike chance, you want vulnerable damage, and of course your main stat. And then after that, whatever other additive bonuses you can get. Now when it comes to utility rolls, you definitely want cooldown reduction, right? Cooldown reduction on your amulet, on your helm. You want movement speed as well, and all this just helps your game make your gameplay a little bit smoother, and it helps you clear stuff faster, and that's why they're good. Now there are some other lines to look out for, but I think those are more build dependent. So for example, attack speed is really good because the more you attack, the more damage you're going to be dealing, right? But it doesn't really work for every build. It's still a really good stat, for example, for the rogue that I'm playing, because it relies a lot on attack speed. So attack speed is important to me for this build. Other lines that are important include core skill damage, if your build includes a core skill, and I would think a lot of builds include core skills, so you can look into that as well. And lucky hit chance is also important if you're playing a build that relies a lot on lucky hit. Now the next thing to figure out is to realize what sort of lines can roll on what slot of gear. So just to give you an example, obviously we all want crit chance, right? But if you're looking for a crit chance roll on a weapon and you're trashing weapons that don't have a crit chance roll, well then you're doing it wrong, because crit chance can't actually roll on weapons. So in order to figure out what kind of rolls can roll on what slot of gear, you want to go to a site like, for example, the Max Roll Planner, and play around with it for a little, because you can see exactly what sort of potential lines you can get on what sort of gear. And back to the critical chance example, I said that you couldn't really roll it on any pieces of gear. Well, that's for rogue, but for another class like sorcerer or necromancer or the offense slot, you can actually roll critical chance, and you can roll stuff like cooldown reduction as an additional stat, and you can also roll lucky hit chance, if I'm not wrong. So depending on the class that you play, you definitely want to figure out what sort of rolls can go into what sort of gear, just so you know what kind of gear you want to look out for when you're looking at different slots of gear. And the Max Roll Planner is just really useful because you can just input, your dream gear, and then you can compare what you have in the BIS slot in the Max Roll Planner and what you're getting from your drops, and make decisions then, so you can be a little bit more discerning about what gear you keep and what gear you throw away. Now, back to the damage buckets, I want to talk about why you want to split your damage bonuses across the different multiplicative buckets. Now, if you understand these sort of game mechanics, you know that in every game with this sort of multiplicative nature and additive nature, you definitely want to maximize and spread your damage bonuses across as many multiplicative categories as possible, because that's just how you get the most damage bonus that you can. If you're new to these sorts of games, then maybe just a quick example will help illustrate why this is important. So when you stack too much damage bonus into one bucket, you run into a thing called diminishing returns. So for example, let's say you deal 200% vulnerable damage. This means against a vulnerable enemy, you'll be dealing 3 times your normal damage, right? Because it's 200% additional damage, so it's 3 times. And if on top of that, if you had a critical strike damage of, let's say, 100%, you'd be dealing 2 times the damage if it was a critical strike. So against a vulnerable enemy, and if you crit them, you'll be dealing 2 times 3, which is 6. Now, if you were to take away, or rather, if you were to put another 100% in to your vulnerable damage, that brings your vulnerable damage up to 300%, meaning you'll be dealing 4 times the damage to vulnerable enemies. So 4 times 2 times, if you crit a vulnerable target, it's going to be 8, right? But if you take that 100% and put it into crit damage instead, you'll then be at 200% critical strike damage and 200% vulnerable damage, which means that your crit strike damage is now dealing 3 times the damage against an opponent, and 3 times 3 is 9. So you realize that spreading damage bonuses across different multiplicative buckets is actually a better way to scale your damage, and that's just, well, I mean, that's just how math works, you know. When you multiply something, it's better than when you're adding something together. On to some general advice, I guess I wish I knew before I started playing Diablo. I feel like in your stash space, I don't know why they did this. It is so limited. I don't have... you don't have any stash space at all. Well, you know, if you want to fix this, you can make new characters just to hold your gear, you know, item mules. But that gets a bit tiring. So really, the advice I wish I had before I started playing Diablo was that if I would want to try out different characters, just focus on one build for each character, and then you can associate maybe one tab to a certain character and just trash all the stuff that isn't really important to the build that you're running. If you're the kind of player who likes to main a character, you know, try out different builds on that one character, then I guess you wouldn't really have this problem. You know, you could have a different stash slot for every different build you want to try. But if you're like me, and especially because seasons haven't even started yet, right? You want to get a feel of every character, you want to try out different characters and how they play. So personally, I would just focus on one build for each class, and then, you know, I can just try out the different classes and have one stash slot available to each of those classes. And another thing that's important is that you probably want to pre-plan your builds, or if you're following a build, you want to understand the build and understand what aspects you need and what lines you're going to need on your gear, so that you can be more discerning when looking through your gear and not keep too much stuff such that it clutters up your inventory or your stash space. Another thing is that, I mean, I'm a hoarder, and I know probably a lot of guys out there that are playing this game, they're going to be hoarders as well, and you want to save aspects that are maybe potentially good for another character. Well, it's really not that worth it to do it, and it goes the same for uniques as well, just because when you get a drop on a character, you'll see that there is a required level to that drop. And you'll see that I have some stuff in my stash that I still can't wear because I got these on my Necromancer at a really high level, and there's really just not much point in saving them. When you're going to be leveling a new class, you're going to be getting drops for that class at that level anyway, and maybe the rolls won't be as good, but I think it's just, well, you know, there's no two ways about it. You just don't really have the stash space for it. So just a little extra tidbit of information. If you're thinking, okay, I can save gear to extract aspects from, right, and put it on a lower level character, it doesn't really work that way. When you extract something from a higher level piece of gear, you realize that aspects actually have level requirements to them as well. And when you put that aspect on a piece of gear, that gear then inherits the level requirement from the aspect, And now that gear has the same level requirement. So a funny thing happened to a friend of mine where he had a pretty good helmet on and he had an aspect that was a higher level than he was, and obviously he didn't notice at that point, which is a bit weird as to why Blizzard would allow you to do that, but you know, that's beside the point. So he imprinted it on a piece of gear and the helmet just automatically unequipped itself, and now he doesn't have a helmet. Just don't do it. Don't do it. It's not worth it. It's hilarious. It's not worth it. Now I want to talk a little bit about the end game, and I guess this is kind of half advice and half kind of a rant. If you're just the kind of player who likes to test out different classes and test out different builds, I would advise you to stop at around level 85 or maybe level 90 actually, because when you reach this point in time, your progression really starts to slow down. And what I mean by that is that the power spikes that you feel at an earlier level, it's kind of linear. So if you think about it like a linear graph, you can imagine that your power level is going up like a straight line, you know, at an angle. Especially when you hit World Tier 3, you get a little spike because you're switching to Sacreds, and then you hit World Tier 4, you get another spike because you're switching to Ancestrals. But by the time you hit around level 85, you'll probably have most of your aspects sorted out, probably have some good rolls on them as well. You probably have a few pieces of end game gear, so to speak. And around at this point, you will probably have enough Paragon points to fill 4 boards and use 4 glyphs. So really from this point on, all that you're really hoping for is just for gear to drop with better lines or better rolls on the ranges on your lines, which doesn't really come about that often. Like I said before in another video, you could go multiple levels without having a significant improvement to your gear. And what I mean by significant is it won't feel as significant as before in terms of the power spike that you're getting. You know, if you, for example, if you get a ring that has 4 good lines, crit strike damage, crit strike chance, vulnerable damage, and then maybe an additive offensive roll or max health that's really good, you'll be like, wow, that's a really good ring, that's really cool. And you slap it on, but you won't feel the same power spike as you did when you were switching from, say, Sacreds to Ancestrals. So really at this point, it's when that kind of linear graph starts tapering and flattening out a bit. But the way the mobs and your enemies scale, it kind of feels like they're still going up in a linear sense. So it's a bit weird, but it's as if the higher level you go, you start to feel a little bit weaker, I guess, relatively to where you were before. So it's just a thing where at level 100, you might actually be clearing stuff slower than you were at level 80 if you weren't lucky enough to get really optimized gear. So if you're the kind of person that just likes to try out a build and just get a feel for it before the seasons, kind of the playstyle and maybe the power level of the build that you were running, I think 85 to 90 is a pretty good place to stop. Especially because the EXP needed to get to level 85 from level 1 is the same amount of EXP that you need to get from level 85 to level 100. And add to the fact that, you know, there's no more quests, there's no more campaigns, really you'll just be running the same thing over and over, which is Nightmare Dungeons and Helltides and Legion events that can get a little bit boring, especially if you're just playing the exact one build with it. And of course it's going to be hard to re-gear to another build as well, because it's just hard to find gear and aspects and all of that, and you get limited stash space as well. So yeah, I don't know if it's going to change or if they're going to add another world tier after World Tier 4. Maybe they should do it, but as for now, it's just a little warning, I guess, I want to give to players who maybe aren't at that level yet. You know, you don't need to feel like you need to hit level 100. If you want to play other classes, just go ahead and do it. You know, hit level 85, figure out kind of the playstyle and power level of your build, and just go play another class. You know, don't feel too caught up with the grind to level 100. It's probably not that worth it. Another thing that I want to add is that when you hit World Tier 4, and you can do this before level 70 actually, like if you get a friend to carry you, or if you had a pretty good build at level 60 or 65, you can do the capstone and get access to World Tier 4. When you hit World Tier 4 and start getting access to ancestral drops, really you'll be getting access to the same loot pool as a level 100 character. And I believe that this has been confirmed by a dev who made a comment saying that, you know, when you get access to ancestral gear, you really have access to the entire pool of ancestral gear, because there is a variance in the eye levels that can drop when it comes to ancestral gear. You can get gear that is over 800 eye level, or you can get ancestral gear that are below 700 eye level. And I want to say that as you level and your monsters level with you, that they do drop higher eye level gear more frequently, but I think that's maybe confirmation bias, maybe a little bit of copium, and it's all anecdotal. And just going off the developer comment, I think really, once you hit World Tier 4, that's it for your gear. You don't really get any higher eye level drops the higher you level. Not significantly anyway. So again, another reason why I don't really advocate for grinding to a level 100 if you want to try out different builds, because your gear just isn't really gonna improve the same way as it was doing before. So yeah, go play another class, go play another character, do it.